Well, hello. So welcome to week 8. Hopefully you finished giving all your feedback and thoughts on Hard Times, the Dickens novel. This week we're going to read a novella. Next week we'll read a novella. Then you have a little bit of a break. Short story, but there's some auxiliary work for that. And then it's just success. One last novel and the semester will be over. So, anyway, this week we're going to dive into, we're getting almost close to, we're really getting close to what might be considered modernism, depending on who you ask. Joseph Conrad's work is arguably a work of early modernism, still in the framework of Victorian times, a little bit toward the end, at least his lifetime anyway. His life spans mid-19th century. He doesn't die until the 1920s. So yes, we have Joseph Theodor Konrad Korzeniowski, born to Polish family in what is currently the Ukraine, all of which, though, was owned by Russia. Well, owned by, right? Dominated, controlled by Russia. So, his father was an activist and a poet himself, actually. A writer, in other words. Joseph Conrad's father, for his, activism, he believed in a free Poland. Didn't want to be under Russian rule, in other words. And for that, he was exiled into a really cold part of Russia, where his wife died from tuberculosis. And then, I guess because of the suffering, they allowed him to come home, where he died shortly thereafter, leaving Joseph Conrad an orphan at 11. So the first years of his life, he was raised by this highly idealistic father, and then at 11, he has to grow up with an uncle, which he's fortunate enough to have, I suppose, but that uncle is really conservative, and so I guess some of the more formative years of his life, I suppose, from 11 until he leaves home to become a sailor, under the auspices, under the guidance, if you will, of a more conservative viewed uncle. Thus begins the many dichotomies, the many polar opposites of the life of Joseph Conrad. So he becomes a sailor, sails with the French, learns French, which is pretty dope, right? Until basically there's a point in time where there's political tensions between French and Russia, and they're like, wait, you're Russian? You can't sail with us anymore, which leaves him without any kind of income, and he's just stuck in southern France, where Marseille, I think, is actually northern. I forget where Marseille is. Anyway, he gets into gambling. That's not working out for him. He tries to commit suicide. Fortunately, that didn't work out for him either. Winds up becoming a sailor with the English. So he becomes an English sailor. And then he becomes really well versed in English as a language, third language. And then he becomes a great English writer. Right? Literally, he was writing a book at one point. He's like, I've gone to some really crazy places. He'd literally gone to every continent, all over the world as a sailor. And he started to think, I've seen some cool things. I should start writing about it. And on one of his voyages, he talked to a great British writer, John Galsworthy. And John Galsworthy was like, it sounds like you've got some cool things to say. You should definitely do this stuff. And so that's kind of how he got started. And then his first book sold not that great, but enough for him to think, I should do this. He also became great friends with all kinds of great writers that you may not have heard of, but that's fine. You should read them. I don't have time to put every great writer on this syllabus for a course. But Ford Madox Ford, H.G. Wells, Stephen Crane, Henry James, I already mentioned John Galsworthy. These were all people he hung out with. And so he writes novels in his third language. Which is something that not that many writers have done. Samuel Beckett was an Irishman who wrote in French. Vladimir Nabokov was a Russian who wrote in English. We have Jhumpa Lahiri, primarily writes in English, but it's really gotten into French and started writing some in French too. Milan Kundera, who is a Czech who wrote almost exclusively in French. So anyway, it's just really amazing to think about that, to be a second or third level, removed from your primary language, and then you can become an amazing writer that people read for generations to come. So, one thing I do want to note though, quick quick thing. You should be aware, like, I don't know, what trigger warning. Conrad does use the N-word. Well, his narrator, it's actually his narrator's narrator, which I'll talk about in a quick second. Marlowe does use the N-word, like, I don't even know, regularly, like, not like every page, but at least a dozen times. So just be aware of that. Brace yourself for that. It is upsetting, but it was I'm not trying to shrug it off. It was a long time ago. And also we have to remember that that's not what Conrad is saying. That's what his narrator is saying, right? The narrator is not Conrad, and in fact, you're going to see that there's a narrator. This is like a framed narrative. There's a narrator who tells us that we're sitting on the River Thames. You pronounce it Thames. If you're a Rhode Islander, you might be inclined to say Thames because that's the street in Newport. And I kind of have a pet theory that the rebels, right, the American rebels, stopped pronouncing it in the British way. Because it's spelled exactly the same way as the River Thames, Thames. If you go to England, it's the River Thames. But in Newport, it's Thames Street. And I kind of think that when we started fighting the British that we decided to stop calling it Thames Street and start calling it Thames Street. But anyway, most of this book takes place in Africa. Marlowe is telling this story about his time working for a Belgian concern. It's about colonialism. It's about the rape of Africa. I mean, literally, the numbers are staggering how many Africans were killed by European powers just trying to extract goods and cheaper free labor from Africa. And this is, by the way, you think like, oh yeah, sure, I know about the slave trade. This is after England has banned slavery. This is even after the United States, one of the last nations of the world to ban slavery. Like, nobody banned slavery after us except for Brazil. Literally the last two countries to get around to banning slavery. But past that, these countries were fighting over resources in Africa and just slaughtering people. There's all kinds of discussions about the lawlessness. They're like, they could hang this guy if they want. They could do whatever they want here. It's like a free-for-all. It's a money grab, and it's disgusting. But this book is a little more complex than that. Because we have a narrator who's telling us a story that another guy told him, that creates this sort of weird dynamic where it's not clear where the writer actually thinks about any of this. It's not even, maybe sometimes even clear what either of our narrators think about any of that. Maybe they don't even know what they think about any of this. So that's all stuff to keep in mind. It is dark. It's a dark book. It's called Heart of Darkness. And one thing that's interesting artistically that Conrad will do is remind you that those two concepts are important. The word heart and the word darkness. I mean, you should have a physical text. You can go through. If you don't believe me, you can go through. You can circle every time he uses the word heart. You can circle every time he uses the word dark or darkness, and very often they happen within close proximity of each other, maybe in the same paragraph. And the phrase "heart of darkness" or "heart and dark" or "darkness" will occur very, very often in the same sentence. So that's meant. It's almost like a leitmotif. And a leitmotif is a term that writers we writers have stolen from, I think it's opera, right? And George Lucas famously stole this from opera. Like when you hear the Imperial March, you know that the bad guys are coming. When you hear like there's certain noises like we know something 4C is happening. Vader has his own sound, like music. Little phrase of music, we know Vader's around. So similarly in writing, this is like an interesting thing that someone can do in their third language, but you'll see those words repeating throughout. So that's meant to make you think about how the conscience of man. That's the way they used to say it. We should say humanity, really, but heart of darkness. What does that mean? That's something to think about. And another really important thing, now that we're getting really, really close to modernity here, we're getting kind of modern. So this term ambiguity is an important concept to think about. Ambiguity, A-M-B-I-G-U-I-T-Y. Sometimes people use that term to mean like vagueness. That is not what it means. It's not a lack of meaning. It's a richness of meaning, right? Like vagueness is, I don't know what you mean. Ambiguity is, this could mean more than one or two or even three things. Like this has like a richness of possible interpretations. And that's what we'll see. And another thing that makes this start to be kind of modern is the alienation of the characters, the way in which the characters feel disconnected from society or one another. And of course that builds on this Victorian thing where we feel disconnected from the past. So a big thing of modernity, and we're going to see this even more as we move throughout the last few weeks of the semester, is this idea of alienation. It is a huge thing. I mean, for hundreds and hundreds, for almost all of human history, people got on horses, they got in a buggy, and they went places. And then, like, you know, if you wanted to see something, you had to burn something. And then very, very quickly, those things start to change. Not quite yet with Conrad, but we're getting very close to like electric light and cars and stuff. So there's lots of, I mean, even the train, American writer Thoreau talked about the train. We didn't ride the train rode over us, you know? So like this idea of like everything changing really fast is really important. So yeah, those are some important things to think about. I mean, I don't want to spoil as usual. I'm not trying to give any spoilers, but okay, last thought. Interestingly, the movie Apocalypse Now, Francis Ford Coppola, I think that was. Anyway, the movie Apocalypse Now is based on this, but you can't watch that movie and answer the questions that we're having this week because it's based on it. I mean, that movie takes what happens in the Congo with Conrad's characters and moves it to Vietnam. And so basically that movie is trying to say America in Vietnam was acting in the same colonial imperialist way that what was happening here. And that adds all, because it has to be a feature film, it adds all kinds of extra events and there's lots of things. You really do need to read this book. It starts really slow. It's a slow burn. There's maybe like one action scene, like one thing that actually is like, whoa, stuff's happening. So, you know, bear with that. A lot of the meaning is in the language. And, one last thought. I know I said that. I had a last thought a few minutes ago. But the last thought is just so you know, when they talk about, he keeps it, Marlowe does, the narrator, who's the principal narrator. He keeps things pretty vague about where he is and where he's going. But when he talks about a map and there's colors and swaths of little bits of green, swaths of blue, each one of those colors, he says the red, that I knew when there was red there, that was a good sign. Think redcoats, think England. These are maps that readers of Conrad's time would have known each color represented a nation. So like red is England, blue is France, I think orange is like Portugal, and he's going into the yellow, he says, which represents Belgium. And yeah, so King Leopold, this tiny little country of Belgium, managed to secure this huge area of Congo, which was so many much more times bigger than the country he ruled. And they just ruled it like, kind of like a slaughterhouse, frankly. And you'll see that. So, all right, as always, the discussions are posted. Engage in them. Don't forget to, you should be making 3 posts for every question. There's 3 questions again. So that should be a total of 9 posts from each of you. I think, is that the right math? Yeah, right? 3 for each, yeah. So a total of 9 posts for each one. I am still working through your midterm papers. I'll let you know how those go as soon as I am through them. I'll have updates on grades after that. But as long as you're keeping up with posting, you're probably doing excellent. Otherwise, if you have any other questions, hit me up with email. Don't forget, there's only one T. Otherwise, I'll talk to you guys again next week.